Welcome our speaker, David DuBois, land steward at Baltimore Woods Nature Center in Marcellus, New York. David graduated from SUNY Binghamton in 2016 with a BS in biochemistry. After college, he spent a few years working on trails and wildlife out west, where he cleared trails in the wilderness of Idaho, tracked desert pronghorn in Mexico, chased woodpeckers around a fire scar in Oregon, and monitored declining birds in Montana. In 2020, he started at Baltimore Woods Nature Center, where he's currently director of stewardship and works to keep the 270-acre preserve usable, beautiful, healthy, and ecologically functional. He sits on the board of the Native Orchid Conservation Network and does botanical consulting for local land trusts, as well as the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment at SUNY ESF. For those on Zoom who may not know what SUNY ESF is, it's the State University of New York Environmental Science and Forestry College in Syracuse. David has led numerous plant walks for the New York Flora Association, Finger Lakes Native Plant Society, and other educational organizations. When he's not working, he's out exploring the flora of New York State, trying to better understand the distribution and trends of these important plants. Today, he is going to talk about how to avoid the pitfalls of mistaken identity of native plants. Please welcome David.
Hi, so I'm David. I guess I'm a semi-professional botanist. I do botany professionally in consulting, but I'm going to refer to myself as a botanist for the remainder of this presentation. So this came about through really two things. The first thing, well, I grow native plants, like I assume all of you. And one of the early plants that I got and really thought was beautiful, loved, was blue lupin, Lupinus perennis, a lovely native, pretty rare in the state, but beautiful in the garden. Talk more about that plant later. And it flourished for me in my garden. It was great. And I hadn't seen it in the wild. Finally, a few years after I've been growing it, got a nice patch of it. I went up to Rome Sand Plains out in Rome, New York, and I saw these little scrawny, tiny plants. And I'm comparing plants growing in my yard to plants growing in sand. It's probably got something to do with it. And I commented something about, oh, these look like scraggly little plants. And the person I was with gave me a look. He didn't really say anything, but they gave me a look. And I knew that I had to check myself a little bit. And sure enough, I get back home and start looking at this plant, and it looks very different than the plants that I had seen out in the wild. And I did a little bit more research, and I come to conclude that the plant that I'm growing isn't our native plant. It's this Western look-alike. And it's kind of a hard thing to figure out, like, where are the resources to figure out whether this plant has a look-alike, what that look-alike is, and how to tell them apart. And so you trust the labels most of the time, right? That's what I did, and here I am growing the wrong plant. And then I was listening to a talk with a nurseryman, and he gets to a slide on solidago, the goldenrods, and he had a line that was, I can't really tell the goldenrods apart. They're tough. They're a tricky group, and you hear that here and there. They're tough. They're a tricky group. Can't really tell them apart. And he said, I leave that to the botanists. That's the botanist's job to tell the goldenrods apart. And my first response was, this is the guy that I'm trusting with my labels. And he's leaving it to the botanist. And then I was like, oh, I'm the botanist in this comparison. I'm the one that he's leaving it to. That means that I have to be thinking about these things, be looking at these things, and then making this information accessible to the people who are trying to use it. So that's kind of what I'm hoping this presentation is. Not going to fix all the problems, but at least for the people in this room, it's going to give you a list of plants that you should be looking out for, you should be paying attention to, both when you're buying them, when you're growing them, when you're around them, and you should be sharing that with other people because, you know, you're only one step removed from the botanist here in this room. Nobody on Zoom's going to see that though. All right. So in this presentation, I hope to go through this problem in the native plant supply chain a little bit. I hope that I've already gone through that a little bit. You understand that sometimes plants are mislabeled. Sometimes non-native plants are being sold as native plants. Sometimes those plants are growing in people's yards, potentially escaping cultivation. I spent a lot of time trying to build and taking from technical resources and trying to make it digestible for people in this room. I intend this presentation to be able to be used as a reference. And if you are interested in getting the slides for this, I can send them to you. I built the midsection of this presentation to have A/B comparisons with the native species on one side and the non-native species that's sometimes sold in the same tag on the other side. I want to point out some specific species that I think are potentially being mislabeled, being sold, or have other issues that warrant further examination if you're buying plants, if you're selling plants, if you're sharing plants. And then I want to propose some solutions. This isn't just a doom and gloom presentation, but the end of this should be, these are problems, these are always going to be problems. How do we move beyond that? So I've kind of categorized these lookalikes into a few different groupings. I have native plants that have non-native lookalikes. This is kind of a one-for-one. There's one native plant, there's one non-native plant. Sometimes the non-native plant gets called the native plant. And so you should look out for them and you should be aware of the differences, and you should be critical in buying and critical in sharing. The next group is very similar to the first, but it has an added complexity to it. These are plants that have native plants and non-native plants, but sometimes they hybridize. And at first glance, that might not seem like that big of a difference, but it's a huge difference when you're talking about seeds, because you can correctly identify the native plant and then take the seeds off of it and be growing something that isn't the native plant. It's a hybrid between a non-native and the native. And so that's especially important for people who are growing the plants, that there need to be precautions made to make sure that the correctly identified native plant isn't producing an undesirable hybrid. Then I have some groups of plants that contain both native and non-native members that are just sold as the group of plant. This is probably a problem more for me in the restoration context, but it comes up where you just get a genus. And then finally, I have native plants that are not well understood taxonomically. And this is kind of getting into the edge of what is known about these plants, and pointing out that the state of botanical knowledge is not perfect, and we can't pretend that it is. There are things that we don't know, and that may affect plants we cultivate. So what's the problem? We as habitat gardeners, we who grow native plants, we're trying to support something with growing these native plants, right? We're not growing them just because, well, not everybody's growing them just because they're beautiful and they're you know, a connection to place and all of these other things. But they support other species. They're the basis of food webs. And we're trying to maintain those ecologies in our yard, in the places that we cultivate. And I'm hesitant to say, that we know that these non-native lookalikes are negatively impacting that specific ecology that you're trying to support. But I think that it's relatively safe to say that, each of these plants hasn't been individually studied to see what species of caterpillars host on it, what species don't. But we know that native plants support these native food webs. And we don't know that the non-native plants support those native food webs. For some of these plants, we do know stuff. We know that they are ecological traps, that species that survive on the native version fail on the non-native version. And so there's a real risk in that particular scenario. We also talk a lot about supporting these ecologies and these native animals on our plants. But with good native plant gardening, we're also supporting the native plants themselves. And I think that's important. It's important for how I think about native gardening, that I'm not just supporting the things that depend on the plants, but I'm supporting the plants themselves. And a lot of these plants are, in decline range-wide. And so by supporting the plants, I'm only supporting the plants if I'm planting the right plant. If I'm planting the wrong plant, I'm not supporting that plant at all. I'm actually negatively impacting it. And finally, I hope that you come to the end of this presentation and you're like, oh, there's a lot that botanists don't know. And that's the fact of the matter, right? I'm not up here to say I know everything, and I don't think that anybody who's actually looking at the science would say that they know everything. There's a lot that's not studied. We have a few charismatic plants, a few charismatic relationships that are really well studied, and then there's a lot that's inferred or not known. And so we should be cautious about introducing new plants on the landscape, about assuming no harm. And we should be skeptical that these non-native plants would fill the same role that the native plants do fill. So in this next part of the presentation, I've got these A/B comparisons. On the left-hand side of the screen, I've got our native species with characters of the native species. And on the left-hand side of the screen, I'll have the non-native species, or sorry, on the right-hand side of the screen. I get my lesson rights mixed up. This is why I put this slide in, so we could all agree. Native species is on the left, non-native species is on the right. So back to my first story on sundial lupin. This is a plant. It was called blue lupin until fairly recently. And part of that, the complexity on that is that blue lupin also refers to a species that's found in Western North America, Lupinus polyphyllus. These are two different plants. When you see them side by side, they're very different. Lupinus polyphyllus, the non-native, it's a tall plant. I think 40 centimeters is what I have. 40 centimeters, so robust, big. Lupinus perennis stays smaller, 10 to 20 centimeters tall. When you look at their leaflets, this is the character that a lot of technical resources separate them. So each leaf has multiple leaflets arranged in a kind of a palm-shaped arrangement. On the native one, there are fewer leaflets, so 5 to 7, occasionally up to 11. And on the non-native, there are a lot. There's 11 to 17, occasionally as few as 8. Those leaflets are also different in size. The non-native has much larger leaflets, 7.5 to 13 centimeters long, versus the native, which has 2 to 5 centimeter long leaflets. So like I said, if anybody wants these slides, I can share them with you. You can take down these notes. I also have my references for each of these character states that I'm putting up at the end of the presentation. But this is a plant that the non-native being in cultivation is detrimental. We know it is. And we know it is because the native plant, the Lupinus perennis, is the host plant for the Karner blue butterfly, federally endangered species. It's found in New York State, found in the Albany pine bush. The larva caterpillar hosts on Lupinus perennis, needs Lupinus perennis to complete its life cycle. And when Lupinus polyphilus is planted, the adult will lay eggs on polyphilus, and the caterpillars will die. So it's an ecological trap. Having this plant out in the landscape will attract adults to it, and they will not complete their life cycle. You know, it's a very rare butterfly. It's a federally endangered. This is a plant that, you know, planting it out in certain places, it can have negative effects on really rare critters. My next one is Appalachian barren strawberry. So Wallenstadia fragularioides, and its non-native lookalike, which is Wallenstadia ternata, the Siberian barren strawberry. So these are two very similar plants. Appalachian barren strawberry, it makes a nice ground cover, creeps along the ground. It's really beautiful spring bloomer. And it's not terribly common in the area, but for a while, occasionally, this Wallenstadia ternata, the Siberian barren strawberry, was being sold and labeled as Appalachian barren strawberry, a non-native for a native. So how do you tell these two apart? The very obvious differences, I don't know, none of these are obvious, right? If they were obvious, they wouldn't be mistaken for each other. The subtle differences are the leaf lobing. In the non-native, the leaves are more deeply lobed. So that's, you know, I'm gonna use the laser pointer, even though I was told not to. Over here, these dissections of the leaf go down more than half of the leaf. They're completely missing on these native leaves. And then the flower structure is a little bit different. On Siberian barren strawberry, the petals are wider and they'll actually overlap each other. So you can't see the sepals behind them. On the native one, these sepals will stick out and the petals won't quite touch. Again, it's a little subtle, but it's worth paying attention to. And it's particularly worth paying attention to because in the northern part of its range, this Appalachian barren strawberry doesn't set seed. It's a weird quirk. Exactly why it doesn't set seed is a little bit unclear. Some people speculate that it's because of inbreeding depression, you know, plants moving north following the last glaciation. And then only a few plants made it north and those spread widely. So they're all the same plant, basically, just widely spread. That's a hypothesis. But it begs the question, if you're a grower and you're looking for this plant to grow and you're wanting to grow it from seed, where's that seed coming from? Because it's not coming from here, because the plants here aren't setting seed. So is it coming from further south? Is it coming from a different plant entirely? It's a question. All right. This is the plant that I was already asked about once, whether it would be in this presentation. But the green dragons. So our American green dragon compared to this Chinese green dragon. These are actually two different genera. The American green dragon is Erisamia drancoconitum. And then Chinese green dragon is Pinellia pedatisecta. I had to practice pedatisecta a couple times before I felt good about it. But they're very similar looking overall. You can kind of see both of these have these green flower enshaped in a bract with a long thing that sticks up out of them. And they both have this highly dissected leaf that kind of sits flat. But here I am to tell you about differences. So the differences between them, the central leaf on the native plant is much smaller. On the non-native, it's much larger than the leaves adjacent to it. So you can kind of see here, we've got smaller central leaf with two larger leaves next to it. Again, I'll give you these slides if you want them. The structure of how the flower is held is also useful for differentiating these two. The native plant blooms below the leaves. The non-native plant blooms above the leaves. The flower sticks up higher and blooms above the leaves. So this plant, the native plant's not very common. It's kind of restricted to floodplains, places that see occasional disturbance, rich soils. And I'm not sure, but I would suspect that in cultivation, it doesn't grow very aggressively. The Chinese green dragon, on the other hand, is a very aggressive in cultivation. They'll spread and spread and grow and spread, which I guess makes it nice to grow, but it raises questions of, are we introducing plants that might naturalize? And that's a real question, because in the Southeast US, this plant is naturalized. It grows in the wild. It's escaped cultivation, and it's an established non-native in the Southeast. So we don't want to be spreading the next generation of invasives. This is another one that has a little bit of a history of being misidentified for each other. These are the Agastaches, the anise hyssops. Both of them have that fennelly anise smell to them when their leaves are crushed. The native to the Midwest anise hyssop is slightly different in that it has sharp teeth on its leaves. And the Korean one, this non-native that it's sometimes mislabeled for, has rounded leaves, rounded lobes on the leaves. Also on the underside of the leaf, the native one has this whitish cast from a bunch of small hairs. And the Korean one, the non-native one, has a smooth underside of the leaf, sometimes with some hairs on the veins. But they look very similar. Some major suppliers have mistaken these two. And it's to the point where I believe this is naturalized in Michigan. It shows up in the Michigan flora. So it's escaped cultivation and it's moved on to the landscape, at least in some scenarios. So this is our clematis, our native clematis compared to a non-native lookalike. So this is Clematis virginiana. It's also called Virgin's Bower, and Clematis terniflora, sweet autumn clematis. So I think that in the specialty, the native plant scene, this is pretty well sorted out, but there are definitely some larger retailers that have sold this Clematis tenuiflora under the name Virgin's Bower or under the name Clematis virginiana. And it's a real problem because this Clematis terniflora is an invasive. There's no question about it. It's on the invasive list in New York State. It spreads into the wild. It rapidly naturalizes. It's aggressive. It displaces native plants. It's not a plant that you want to be planting if your goal is to support native plants or native animals that depend on those plants. Honestly, from a glance, this one's pretty easy. On the native species, we have toothed leaves. They're pretty coarsely toothed, but they're distinctly toothed. The leaf kind of looks matte almost. And on the non-native, the sweet autumn clematis, the leaf is shiny and it's completely toothless. But these are plants, they've been misidentified in the past. If you're trying to buy this, if you're trying to get this, you should check it. Here's another one that's kind of infamous. This is our viburnums, our high bush cranberries. So we have an American high bush cranberry, which grows across northern North America. And then there's a European non-native that is frequently mislabeled for the native, and it's a different plant. These two plants diverged at least 5 million years ago, probably more like 13 million years ago. So while they're related, they are not the same thing. So Viburnum trilobum. Viburnum trilobum is our native plant. It has different shaped leaves. I was really struggling to find somebody describing the leaf shape differences in a technical manual and a technical report. And I'm a little bit disappointed that I couldn't find great support for the leaf shape differences, but they look so different. When you see them, they look so different. This central lobe on Viburnum trilobum is long, it's pointed. It's much bigger than the side lobes. And then on the non-native version of this, that's everywhere. Gelder rose. These leaves are more, each lobe is about the same size. They're stouter, they're shorter. But the key that everybody uses to tell these two plants apart is the shape of their petiole glands. So just below the leaf blade, there's a series of glands. The extrafloral nectaries, they exude a little bit of sweet stuff that probably attracts ants. On the native plant, there's a few of those nectaries, maybe 4. They're club shaped, they're round at the top. And on the non-native, the Viburnum opulus, these are deep and cup shaped. And there are a lot of them. You know, on this picture, what's that, 8 or so? There can be like 16. And honestly, when you look at this portion of the leaf right below the blade, you'll see just a whole line of them, or 2 lines of them. That's a tough character to differentiate, and it's not always clear which side of that divide you're looking at. So it's really tough to use until you've seen a lot and you've seen both sides, and oh, this one's club shaped, oh, this one's cup shaped. My favorite character that separates these two plants, and it's a little bit of you're rolling the dice when you try it, is the taste of the fruit. Because the native Viburnum trilobum has a nice tasting fruit. It tastes like a cranberry. You know, it's tart, it's not really sweet, but pleasant flavor. Viburnum opulus, it's terrible, awful, like retchingly bad. But you can if you're really bold, you can take a little bit of juice and tap it to your tongue, and you'll know instantly whether you had the right one or the wrong one. And even if you crush the berry in your hand, you can usually smell the foul smell of Viburnum opulus, the Gelder rose. So on the landscape, Gelder rose in this area outnumbers Viburnum trilobum 100 to 1. Yeah, if you see this out in the wild, you're almost certainly looking at Viburnum opulus. You're looking at this European plant. I'm not 100% sure why it's so abundant. I know it was distributed for hedgerow stabilization for a while. I'm not sure if that was a case of mistaken identity when they were establishing it, whether they thought they were establishing a native thing or whether because it was something that grew quickly, so might as well plant more of it. In this area, Viburnum trilobum is pretty restricted to nice wetlands, usually with a high pH. But I don't know the last time I've seen one in central New York. And then this is one that I haven't heard people talk much about, but it's one that concerns me because I'm definitely seeing it out on the landscape and not planted. This is our Cornus sericea versus Cornus alba. So this is our native red twig dogwood versus Tartarian dogwood. Both are known for their bright red stems. And there's definitely taxonomic complexity going on here. They're not well differentiated, and you can even find cultivars of one being listed as cultivars of the other. And depending on what resource you're looking at, that might be a cultivar of Cornus sericea, or it might be a cultivar of Cornus alba. It took me a long time to track down what I felt was an authoritative enough source to put on this picture. It ended up being the University of Ghent herbarium that had a key to cultivated species with Cornus sericea on one side and Cornus alba on the other side. And what they said was Cornus alba is a more compact shrub. So I found a picture that actually shows this very well. And of course, out in the wild, it's much more difficult to tell. But you can see on Cornus alba, it's kind of a vase-shaped shrub. Everything's coming from a single base. A lot sticking up from the same place, right? And then in Cornus sericea, it's more spread out, more diffuse. They called it a stoloniferous shrub. I think stoloniferous is kind of the wrong word to use here, but maybe there's a translation issue between how Europeans use stoloniferous versus how I would use stoloniferous. But you can kind of see that there's a stem coming up here and a stem coming up there and a stem coming up there. It's kind of more diffuse, not all coming up from the same spot. And then there's a seed difference. I'll have to measure some of the seeds in the Cornus sericea I see around and see whether this holds up, but the length should be smaller than the width in our native, and the length should be greater than the width in the non-native. I'll check that. This is another interesting one because we don't have this recorded as naturalized in New York State yet, and I would be shocked if it's not. There's last year I have a record of a different dogwood that wasn't recorded as naturalized in the state, that was definitely naturalized when I found it. So I kind of think that this is a hidden plant that even botanists aren't catching when it's out on the landscape. One more thing about this plant, there's a third plant in here that I chose not to talk about, and it's another native. This is Cornus amomum, silky dogwood. Silky dogwood has that growth form that's a lot more like Cornus alba. But there are other differences to tell Cornus alba from silky dogwood. And if you're curious about them, hold it for the questions. So there are some other examples. I won't go into full detail on these, but these are other ones that might be worth paying attention to if you're trying to get one of these plants. Wood anemone versus European windflower, anemone quinquefolia versus anemone nemorosa. I know that at least at some point, these two were misidentified occasionally because at our garden in Baltimore Woods, we have the wrong species in. American jumpseed versus Asian jumpseed. This is a plant that's naturalizing in New York City that people like Daniel Atha are paying attention to and noticing that there are two species here. Tropical milkweed versus butterfly milkweed. This has gotten a lot of talk further south, especially. where tropical milkweed can be planted as a perennial. Up here, it's not the tropics. So this stays an annual. It doesn't have the same completely detrimental to monarch populations effects as it does elsewhere in the country. But they look similar, and definitely there have been confusion in the past. And then prickly ash versus Szechuan peppercorn, which I haven't seen be mislabeled yet, and I haven't heard it being mislabeled yet, but Szechuan peppercorn is an emerging invasive, and I think that it's worth being aware that there's a native look-alike. So that's kind of the end of my one-to-one comparisons. Hopefully this is the end of everybody holding their breath and wondering whether they have the right plant. But this next part, it's plants that hybridize, non-native plants that hybridize with native plants. So I mentioned that this is similar to this one-to-one comparison that we just did, but there's an added complexity. There's an added complexity for a grower, especially, that unless you are doing things to ensure that your pollen parent, that you know your pollen parent and your seed parent, you risk having these native plants produce hybrid offspring. And those hybrid offspring can be hard to detect on the landscape. They're probably more vigorous. They have this hybrid vigor trait. And they may or may not be doing what the native plant does on the landscape. This is like, we don't know. I can't say with certainty whether the hybrid is doing everything that the native is doing. But we should be cautious about it. We shouldn't accept for it as a given that the hybrid does everything that the native does. So the first one is Morus rubra versus Morus alba. This is our red mulberry, lovely native, uncommon, kind of hard to grow, versus white mulberry, which is everywhere, pretty aggressive, omnipresent on the landscape. If you were going to grab a mulberry tree, chances are you're grabbing a white mulberry, a Morus alba. They can be told apart. Once you get to know the difference between the two, they feel pretty distinctive. Morus alba has these shiny, smooth leaves. The top side shiny and smooth. They're also kind of small, maybe a little bit bigger, but and then compared to Morus rubra, the red mulberry, the leaves are covered with these short, stiff hairs. They kind of have this matte appearance. And they're much bigger. Like these are pretty big leaves. What do I have on measurements here? 18 centimeters. So, 8 inches or something. And up to twice that. The other thing is leaf shape. On Morus rubra, on our native red mulberry, those leaves end in a long acuminate point, kind of this extended, drawn out tip. You kind of see it here. And on Morus alba, it's not nearly as dramatic. Kind of comes to its own point in its own time. But because white mulberry is so much more common on the landscape, if you have a red mulberry tree that produces fruit and you collect that fruit, chances are that a lot of those seeds are going to produce hybrid offspring. So there has to be some sort of control on where the pollen's coming from if you're trying to get true red mulberry, or you have to vegetatively propagate. And this is a case where vegetative propagation may be more appropriate for distribution rather than seed propagation. Another one here, and it's a very similar thing that's happening on the landscape. It's a little bit less common to see butternut in cultivation, although I have seen people sell butternut, and I've gotten, I won't spoil the next slide, but butternut, a lovely native tree, relative to black walnut, hybridizes with Japanese walnut. It's also called heart nut. Heart nut's one of the big cultivars. And it's actually, the hybrid is actually produced and sold and was used in nut production for a while under the name Buert, which is kind of a, you know, a combination of butternut and heart. These are tough to tell apart. And it only gets tougher the more you dig into it. The best character to tell pure butternut from pure Japanese walnut is this notch on the top of the leaf scar. In butternut, it's straight across the top. And in Japanese walnut, fortunately, this was the best picture I could find. It's got this big V-shaped notch right in the top. But of course, these are the individual species on either side of the spectrum. And in the middle, there's a whole group of hybrids. And those hybrids range all the way from mostly looking like a butternut with a little bit of Japanese walnut influence to mostly looking like a Japanese walnut with a little bit of butternut influence. And it's really tough. And it's made tougher because our butternuts are being lost at tremendous rates to an invasive pest, butternut canker disease, to the point where you pretty much can't find a butternut that doesn't have butternut canker disease on it. So there's this selective pressure that these wild plants are experiencing to incorporate Japanese walnut genes that have resistance to butternut canker disease into the plant. But it also becomes a problem on the cultivation side, because there are organizations, you know, places like the New York State Tree Nursery, that are trying to maintain this plant on the landscape. And so they're going out and they're collecting a lot of seeds. And what are the trees that are producing the most seeds? They're the hybrids. And so these hybrids are then being distributed as butternuts and being outplanted to try to protect butternut genes. And really they're protecting hybrid genes. So it's a real landscape-wide problem. It's not going to be solved by people checking their butternut leaf scars. But I went out to get a better picture of this butternut leaf scar, and I was like, I know a butternut. It grew wild. I can go right up to it. I can grab it, and I pulled out the first picture. And I was like, it's not really straight across. It's kind of got a little bit of a notch. And then on this previous slide, I also talk about a pith character, the color of the pith and the size of the pith gaps. And I started looking at this and I'm like, is this maple syrup brown or is this chocolate brown? And then I got to the terminal bud, which has another character, and that looks kind of greenish. And the branch looks kind of greenish, and it's pretty hairy. And over the course of about half an hour of comparing my notes and comparing a wonderful resource for telling apart these hybrids and the plant that I was looking at, I decided that I had a hybrid that I was looking at, and I needed to find another picture to show on this previous slide that had a leaf scar that went straight across, or else nobody would believe me. But they're out on the landscape, and they're out on the landscape because they're being cultivated and they're being sold as butternuts. Sure enough, I found some more plants that we had planted that probably are hybrids. It's a problem. So there are some other examples of this where these plants hybridize, where there's where planting the non-native can actually spread those genes into native populations. Our American bittersweet hybridizes with the Asiatic bittersweet. And so if you're trying to grow American bittersweet, you have to be careful about where pollen's coming from, because the Asian bittersweet creates a lot more flowers, creates a lot more seed, creates a lot more pollen. So on the landscape, it's probably going to cross. And then American chestnut and Chinese chestnut. This is another plant that's there are hybrids out there, and there are hybrids that aren't identified as hybrids out there. That's more on the restoration side. I don't think many people are planting chestnuts in their yard, but you should. It's a lovely tree. I have one in my yard. So I'm gonna go into this next category, and this probably touches habitat gardeners the least, but I think it's worth noting because I think it's a problem in the native plant cultivation space. And that's selling plants without identifying them. So frequently in restorations, certain groups of plants will be grouped as a group. And you might buy 1,000 willow whips. But by condensing everything into a group, you're limiting your ability to plant them in the right place. You're limiting the ability to differentiate non-native elements from native elements. It makes it harder to plant the right species in the right place at the right time. So willows are like the example of this. Willows are frequently sold as willow, Salix spa. But there are 23 species of willows in New York State, plus as many hybrids, if not more hybrids. And 6 of those 23 are non-native. They're not interchangeable in habitat. They're not interchangeable in ecological function. They're different plants. They grow in different places. And they should be sold as different plants. So along the bottom, I have a few examples of our native willows. I have sage leaf willow closest to me on the left-hand side of the screen here. That's Salix candidum, restricted to high quality, mineral-rich wetlands, a lovely plant. There's Bebb's willow in the middle. And then on the right there is Salix interior, sandbar willow. That's an interesting one because it blooms much later than all the other willows, and it supports a bee that is restricted entirely to sandbar willow. And then above them, on the right-hand side of the screen here, there's Salix purpurea, basket willow, which has been widely cultivated, widely planted. It's common on the landscape, and I think it's going to be more common. But unless we're differentiating which willow are you planting, these non-natives will continue to pass as natives and be planted by people who want to plant natives and enter the landscape. I also have violets in this category, which maybe is a little bit harsh to violets, but I like the violets a lot. There's a huge diversity, something like 80 species and probably twice as many hybrids. And there are a few non-native violets that you should be aware of if you're trying to add violets to your landscape. Viola odorata is the classic one, which is on the bottom right here. Viola odorata, it's at every old home site. It's pretty common in secondary forests. It's super weedy. It spreads really aggressively. You know, I sometimes, as I'm saying these things, I'm like, the gardeners here are like, that's what I want. I want it to spread really aggressively and fill up space. But it'll leave beds and it'll naturalize into the woods. And there are definitely naturalized populations of English violet around. There's also another violet that's just starting to naturalize, been documented in New York City, which could be spread in a similar way, arcuata. But we have tons of native diversity of violets that are amazing and are beautiful and have different habitats.
David, just notice the leaf toothing, the toothing of the leaves on odorata.
Yeah.
Very distinct leaf toothing. Kind of different than
It also
any
is,
of our other violets.
it's fuzzy on the top too, and so it has a different look to it. It's like it's almost I call it matte, but it's more dull looking.
Is that the one on the far right?
Yeah, this one down here.
Far right, lower.
Lower far right, yeah. And then along the bottom here, starting from the left, there's Viola striata. a lovely native white violet. It blooms pretty late for violets. It's like June. Then Viola rotundifolia, the round leaf violet, a very early bloomer, like mid-April. It's one of our 2 yellow violets. And then Labrador violet, next native one, another beautiful blue violet. Yeah, I just wanted to include this because I think that there's so much beautiful native violet diversity that it's so sad to see it lumped as just viola. And so I'm getting to the part of the presentation that I had the most difficulty trying to figure out how I would present this, because it's not very interesting to go, I don't know, shrug my shoulders. But the state of plant knowledge is incomplete. We do not know everything about every plant. We don't even know what to call every plant. And there is legitimate disagreement about what to call certain plants. You know, some groups will refer to it as a subspecies. Some groups will refer to it as a variety. Some groups will refer to it as nothing. So how do we, as people who are trying to grow native plants and trying to support native ecosystems, work through these difficulties? And I think part of that is just being aware that these are groups where knowledge is incomplete. And these are groups where a name might not mean what we expect a name to mean. Another part of this is that there isn't a convention for ecotype or regional variation, right? We don't have a Latin name for an ecotype. We don't have a Latin name for a regional variant. Sometimes they deserve their own name, and sometimes they might not. But how do we make that a uniform process and make it clear what is meant in a name? So my first thing here is the Solomon seals. Now, I was hoping to include this in the first half of my presentation, because we have this native plant, Polygonatum biflorum varcommutatum, the giant Solomon seal. And that's down here in the bottom right. Bottom left, sorry, thank you. Down here in the bottom left. And there's another plant that is planted that kind of looks similar to it, and it's a little bit taller, and it's got more flowers. And when I was building this presentation, I thought I was going to call this Polygonatum multiflorum. And there's this second plant that's planted, and it was part of like traditional English gardens. It's called Polygonatum multiflorum. And so I was looking for a place that mentioned Polygonatum multiflorum, mentioned Polygonatum biflorum varcommutatum, and it had them in a key together. And I went through all the North American resources that I could find. I couldn't find a key that included both of those species. And I started going through some European resources. And I don't know the European resources as well. I don't use them very often. And I couldn't find a satisfactory answer. And then I found that there's a hybrid between Polygonatum multiflorum and this other plant that's also cultivated, Polygonatum odораtum. So that's the middle bottom and the top right, a hybrid. And then I kept finding references in American publications to lines like, a modern synthesis of Polygonatum is needed, or there are characters that separate different groups, but those characters don't necessarily mesh with the genes. So what's going on? Or there's polyploidy. There's these times when these plants have duplicated their chromosomes, but they aren't associated with morphological characters. And I decided that I could say some stuff, but it's probably not the most accurate thing to do. And if I'm gonna put a resource together, I probably shouldn't say those things, only to maybe have to change them in a couple years. After that mythical modern study of polygonatum comes out. But there are definitely non-native type plants that came from English gardens that are in cultivation in this area. And there are probably, although I'm not 100% certain, native plants that come from native Eastern North American lineages in cultivation in the area. I do not know how to tell them apart confidently. I tried a few different things and I'm not 100% sure. There's taxonomic complexity here. And we really need to figure out what's going on. The royal way. You know, studies need to happen to understand this a little bit better. If you're skeptical and a little bit paranoid, the things that I've read from not authoritative sources are that so the non-native plants will have this little white section that they refer to as a petiole, versus no petioles on the native plants. And depending on what source you read, maybe the non-native plants will have 3, 4, 5 flowers, but then on other sources, it says the native plants have up to 6 flowers. So there's confusion in the literature. And it's hard to turn that into anything actionable. And another one, this is it. I'm worried that this presentation makes some people feel like they're being called out specifically. The hairspells, Campanula rotundifolia. It's a lovely plant. It's beautiful. I understand why everybody would want it in their garden. But there's stuff going on that is not encapsulated, not captured by the name Campanula rotundifolia. Campanula rotundifolia refers to plants in Europe. It refers to plants in the high Arctic. It refers to plants in the Rocky Mountains. It refers to plants in Eastern North America. And it's unclear how those plants are related to each other. And what does that mean for somebody who's trying to grow them? This is another plant that has a weird level of polyploidy. As it moved from Europe to North America, or across Europe, it doubled its genome, became more vigorous, and spread much more on this higher level of genome duplication. But if you're buying something that's labeled as Campanula rotundifolia, there's no guarantee that that's coming from plants that are from North America. Could be referring to plants that are coming from Europe. And these plants are probably different. So I have this wonderful paper that looked at some of the genes and tried to figure out how distantly related these plants are. And it found that this species started diverging about 2 million years ago, 2.2 million years ago. And so are you getting a plant that's 2.2 million years removed from the native ecology that you're trying to support? All the way down to 100,000 years ago, when the European and the American plants diverged more completely. There's complexity, and it's not encompassed in a name. And the more you try to put a name to it, the more confusing it gets, because there both isn't a name and there are a profound number of names. And it's unclear what any of them are referring to. This is another plant that's in desperate need of a modern study to figure out what we have and what we don't have. So there are a bunch of these messy groups. And a lot of these are in cultivation. The nodding onions, there are like 6 species of nodding onions, depending on who you're asking, when you're asking it. It's messy. This is the messy group. Yarrows, this is another plant that ranges across the northern hemisphere. It's in Asia, it's in Europe, it's in North America. For a while, people were saying that the North American stuff is all invasive. That's not the line anymore, that the North America has its own native yarrow, and it's probably different than the other ones, but how do you tell them apart? It's tricky. Red raspberry, this is a plant that definitely has a northeastern North American subspecies, it's usually referred to as. But who's checking their plant tags for subspecies? Same with the elderberries, Sambucus racemosa and Sambucus nigra. You know, some people refer to the native plants for red elderberry as Sambucus pubescens, and for black elderberry, Sambucus canadensis, but not always. So what is a name trying to describe? It's not always clear. And then the service berries, Amelanchier. This is a complicated genus with a lot of hybridization going on. There are 6 species, there's 6 kind of foundational species in this group, and then all 6 of them hybridize, and then those hybrids all hybridize, and then those hybrids sometimes hybridize. And in fact, the most recent treatment of the service berries for this region has these broad groups that, you know, you'll get to the end of a key and they'll say a complex of hybrids with the parentage of Amelanchier arborea. It's kind of unsatisfying, but that's where we are with Amelanchier. And while there are 2 natives to New York, there are also 4 other plants that are not native to New York. And bringing them into cultivation, you're opening up more opportunities for more hybrids to spread across the landscape. It's a very messy process, and it's messy in the taxonomic sense too. So this is my slide of all's not lost. It'll be okay. So what can we do? We know that there are these plants that have non-native lookalikes that are being sold as native plants. What do we do to move forward? The first thing is look at your plants. Especially on these plants where we know that there are non-native lookalikes, examine them critically before you buy them, before you share them, before you spread them. Keep an eye on plants in your garden and also plants in the wild. You know, the plants in your garden should look like the plants in other people's gardens and the plants that are growing naturally. That's how we start detecting that there are problems. The next thing, and this is really where I think the most important takeaway from this presentation is, we should be growing from local seed sources, and we should be growing from wild local seed sources. There is a risk by centralizing seed production, by centralizing plant propagation, that one mistake can have a cascade effect and spread these misidentifications throughout the system. And especially for things with messy taxonomies, where there's an incomplete understanding of what's going on with the plants themselves. By collecting things that are local, at the very least, we're not making the problem worse. We're not spreading non-native plants from elsewhere. I think that there needs to be better documentation of seed collections. So this is a thing that's, I've been hearing from, seed banks. They're looking for vouchers, so press specimens to go along with seed collections. So if there's ever any question of what plant was this seed collected from, there's a physical document, there's a physical specimen that can be referred back to, and we can figure out before it becomes a problem in the supply chain. And then verify with botanists. You know, I think that there needs to be more talk between botanists and growers about what's being grown, what's out there, and what the pitfalls potentially are. So onto some resources that I consulted. This is kind of my my put together of some resources that you could use. The first three here are free online resources. You can put in the plant that you're looking for, the plant that you're confused with. And if it's growing wild, they'll come up in these resources. So this is the Go Botany website. This is produced by the New England Native Plant Society. It's based off the Flora Nova Anglicae, which was written by Arthur Haynes a few years ago. It's a wonderful website. It's got a lot of pictures, a lot of comparisons, but it's really backed up by some hard science about how you tell these plants apart and how you can be confident that you're telling these plants apart. Another one, it's not quite as slick, but it's very nice and it's very usable, is the Flora of Michigan. That's based on the Flora of Michigan by Boss and Resnischek, another, you know, technical manual, but definitely usable. And then third here is the Flora of Southeastern US, which is a resource that's in the process of being revised and worked on, being written by or being edited by Alan Weekly. And all of these are free, they're all online. They're definitely useful. And then I wanted to credit the Ghent University Arboretum for helping me figure out the difference between Cornus alba and Cornus sericea. I also have a couple of like specific examples here. These are more technical. There are a couple of papers in here, but this middle one on Juglans cinerea on the butternut. If you're questioning whether you have a butternut hybrid, this is probably the resource to use. It goes into depth about it. And thank you. I want to open up real quick. If anybody wants these slides, feel free to send me an email.
Just
And
a note.
yeah.
To reduce those emails. If you watch the playback on YouTube, you can use print screen to snap your slides.
Okay. Yeah. And also if there's anything that I'm missing that you feel like could be in this presentation. This is the first time I've given this presentation. I'd like to give it again. So if there are things that I'm missing, let me know.
Just before we start the questions.
Yes.
Usually we'll do a few from the people who are here, and then we'll do some from the people on Zoom, so we kind of go back and forth.
Yeah, and
Okay.
you have to repeat, sometimes you have to repeat. If someone in the room asks if you could repeat it.
Sounds good.
Someone, yeah, thank you.
Any questions?
Yes, how do you feel about some of these apps where you can picture a plant and it gives you information on it? Like, I think the one I use is picture this, I think.
Yeah, so the question is, how do I feel about plant ones? And you know, they're taking my job. No, but I think that they were useful, but I don't think they are a replacement for critical thinking and doing a little bit of work to figure out stuff for yourself. Because you can get an answer, right? But how do you know that that answer is correct? And this is where going back to going back to these resources like the Go Botany website that have these resources that have been vetted and well studied. And you can do an A/B comparison. You can compare one to the other. They're really important. So I think that plan apps have a place and they're useful, but they aren't a replacement for more technical resources.
I have a question.
Yeah.
On the viburnums and those. Oh, forget the name of.
The petiole glands.
Petiole gland. Where are the petiole glands on the leaf?
Okay, so the leaf has two parts to it. It's got a blade and it's got a petiole. So the petiole attaches back to the stem.
Okay,
So it kind of looks like, I don't know, it's a stem of the leaf.
okay,
But you know, when the leaf falls, that petiole comes with it.
yeah. I
So
was
the,
wondering, in the picture, was that like blown up?
yeah, so if like you can picture my hand here, my hand's the blade, my arm's the petiole.
Mhm.
They're right at the base of the blade.
Okay.
And they're very small. They're
So
probably,
basically at your wrist.
yeah, basically on my wrist.
I never noticed them.
Yeah, they're probably maybe 2 millimeters across.
In that picture, on some of the leaves, you could actually just see them at the base
Yeah,
of the leaf blade
Yeah.
of that.
Carol, could we go back to that viburnum picture?
You can.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, wait.
Oh, you know why? Because I'm fiddling with it.
Oh, that's fine.
But it's there,
Yeah, right, yeah.
so they're very small.
Yeah.
they're not
Yeah.
close.
There we go.
I think everything.
Let's see.
There you go.
Right here. Yeah, they're right here.
Oh, they are
Actually,
like
like,
Yeah,
just
yeah,
to-
very cute. Yeah, because I'm looking at them.
They're also weird. Yeah. Invest in a hand lens.
Yeah, yeah. And a pen and.
And 2 pens, and you gotta have something to throw on the ground.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question, regarding the native plants, do you have any kind of a source that, you know, the black walnut tree is toxic to certain types of plants? Is there a source that I can refer to, because I have a black walnut, obviously? What native plants don't like it?
I know that there are a couple of resources about plants that are tolerant to grow under black walnuts. Who have I seen produce them? I don't have a particular one that I can cite off the top of my head, though. For the most part, it seems that the native plants are more tolerant of that than non-natives, though.
Pretty sure now that we have polyphyllis and not perennis like we thought. A client gave it to me, but it was purchased locally at probably at Haytner's or something like that. Where do you stand on me ripping it out, since we're unlikely to get Carner blue butterfly population here, but they have been visited by a ton of bees.
Yeah,
Tons of bees.
I almost put a picture on my on this first slide of a state endangered bee at Polyphyllis, because I've seen that.
I can stop spreading it.
Well, I
because
specifically didn't want to tell people what to do in this presentation. It was more think about it, be aware of it, and then you can make your own decision. In my own case, I was very fortunate that my Polyphyllis died. I didn't have to make that decision. It made it for me.
I attempted to grow perennis from seed and put it out in the yard and was not as successful as these beautiful plants that I was given by a client.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a reason for that.
I'm sorry to wonder.
Well, so in the place where I had Polyphyllis, I am gonna put about 50 pounds of sand,
Okay.
maybe 100 pounds of sand, and try to get some of the native growing in this little sand swale that I make. For what it's worth, the native seed's pretty easy to germinate.
Yeah, they came
But-
up, they just didn't stick around.
Yeah. But
Okay.
I'm not gonna tell people what to do. We're going to Zoom?
Question here. Mary asked, I purchased chocolate white snake root. Ageratina altissima var altissima chocolate several years ago, which I think is a native cultivar. When it spread around my garden by seed, it looks like white snake root and is pretty aggressive. Is that common when you purchase a cultivar?
It's tough to say whether that's a cultivar thing. It's probably more of a white snake root thing. White snake root's pretty aggressive. It spreads a lot. It's maybe the only native plant that I've seen spread vigorously under Norway spruce. But there are definitely white snake roots that spread widely. I'm not familiar with the chocolate cultivar though.
We were given a chocolate cultivar sample a number of years ago by someone who actually was at least at one point on it, part of the New York State native plants and invasive plants. And that chocolate snake is spread extremely vigorously all over again for years.
Although it's now being outcompeted by other natives. Including
In some
us.
places, yeah. But yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I'll go to you, Joe.
And I was curious about the red stem dogwood and the alba.
Yeah,
Is the color of the pith white in both of those?
I believe so. So that's how you would tell it apart from a momum. Yeah.
Momum is very distinctly brown. That's how you would tell alba from a momum, but the alba is white also.
Yeah. And I'm not 100% sure on that. I need to go look at some cultivated dogwoods and start cutting them apart. But you see plants that look like alba around. And if you look for like a line of planted, like really winter color dogwoods, I think that a lot of those are alba.
How about another one?
Yeah, another one from Zoom.
Okay. I brought wild local collected seeds from Western Massachusetts to propagate for my garden here. These are all species that are found in similar habitats and soils in central New York. Is it ill-advised for me to grow out these seeds as an advocate for native plants? I think because they came from Western Massachusetts, I think she's asking. Is that close enough?
I always think that closer is better. And as local as possible is the ideal. But we're working in the real world, and I think that's a decision that you have to make is whichever ecoregion that came from, is that close enough to the ecoregion that you're planting in to be compatible with your goals? I'm not here to tell people what to do. I'm here to give them the information that they can make the decisions that they want to make. Yeah.
Going with the question about pulling them out and sort of making your own decision, I definitely have the non-native clematis and mulberry, and my kids and like the birds love to eat mulberry, so would you, in your opinion, pull them out?
If this were my yard, I would pull the clematis and I would look at the mulberry and ponder whether to pull it or not over and over again. And it'd probably come in waves where in the winter I'd be like, I should just cut it down and nuke it now. And then when it fruits, I'd probably eat the fruits and calm down a little bit. But the clematis in particular, that's a plant that I'm concerned about as a land manager. It's an emerging invasive. It's not super common in the area, but once it is super common, then it's past the point of trying to control it. That's a plant that I'm concerned about.
One more from the Zoom. Ruth asks, I've always wondered if the lupin in the lupin lady was actually spreading lupin polyphilus throughout Maine. I don't know what the lupin.
Uh-oh.
Not even that close. Not even that close.
I don't know anything about the lupin lady or.
I don't know, it's the European
It was a European species.
lupin lady.
This lupin lady at book can take place in Maine, which has a lot of.
It's a
lupin.
book.
It's a children's book.
Oh, okay.
About somebody spreading lupin all over Maine, and Maine has a lot of lupin.
Which they did.
Which they did, and it's not native.
Oh, man.
So the answer is, yeah. Spreading polyphilus.
No,
No, they were spreading-
they were spreading
A
European.
European.
Oh, I'm sorry,
polyphilus.
polyphilus.
Yeah, Western North American, yeah.
I want your opinion about this. On a practical level, for people who are not necessarily botanists, but just want to make sure that their gardens become native gardens and, you know, eliminating the non-natives and putting in more natives. And I feel like I've been really victimized by the nursery industry here, including at the farmer's market. And many, from Ballantyne to Cross Creek to, I mean, they're all of the nurseries in the area I've tried, and I'm finding increasingly that they're selling cultivars in the name of. So we're here a select group of people who are trying to get beyond the mega industry of, which is really a mega industry now, of selling fake natives, which are, I mean, I've spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars in my stupidity, you know, as I improved my knowledge base and attended meetings like this and got more and more sophisticated. But I was just an ordinary gardener that liked to plant roses and delphinium and lupin and whatever. And in my stupidity, I didn't know that the nursery industry was countering this. And I'm wondering, what is a practical solution to educating nurseries? Or are they just, because the nursery owners just do it? And my efforts have been to, every time I go to a nursery, talk to the owners, talk to the managers and say, this is a cultivar, this isn't real. Can you find me? Do you have the real thing? And the level of ignorance, and I've done this where my kids live in Oregon, in Virginia. And I'm seeing the same thing across all these states. So what is your thought about maybe educating nursery people who are not botanists, you know, owners and managers, and getting our influence out there, like gradually or in a concerted effort from our organization? Could we invite them to something like this, a modified version, practical?
Like I built this presentation. Partly with nursery people in mind, right? I think that being aware of these is most important for nursery managers when they're thinking about where they're sourcing seeds, where they're thinking about where they're sourcing propagules. On the other hand, I think that a big part of this, I think that more people should be growing more plants from wild sources. And I keep saying these wild sources, and that's a little bit ambiguous, and it presents a problem if everybody's going out and collecting seeds. But we need to be moving these wild populations partly to cultivation, because that's where the plants are now. And if we're gonna grow them, we need to be using the resource to grow from. I'd love to see more nursery owners thinking about this kind of thing. I don't know how to solve the problem. I'm here giving a presentation. This is my step on that journey, but
My
Yeah.
thought on it is that as consumers, we can push this. And one of the big ways we can do this is look for nurseries like the Plantsman that go out and collect local seeds and propagate local seeds
Yeah,
and then sells them.
and I really think that
Plants.
the Plantsman Yellow Tag program is like kind of the gold standard of what I see as working.
I just want to point out that we have the native plant shopping guide, so there's more than the Plantsman, and there are nurseries that are trying to do this. They're small, they're startups, they need your support. So please always consult our native plant shopping guide.
It just is also another, I mean, as somebody who had volunteer red twig dogwood, which I'm now looking at and going. That has been there, that I did not plant, and I let my, my lawn, I got rid of my lawn and let everything grow that had been there. We don't know whether or not all of our volunteers
That's-
are even native.
That's very true.
So
Um,
I'm questioning
If-
everything.
if you're really questioning that it's Cornus alba and it's really a volunteer, I'm interested in that plant. I want to get the state record on
There are
Cornus alba.
volunteers. There are volunteers. I let it spread to make a hedgerow.
Okay,
I added native hazel. I added hazelnut that I purchased from Prairie Moon. And I have added other things, but I have a willow volunteer that I can't really do anything about because it got in there before I knew it was there, and now it's established.
now it's there.
And red twig dogwood that is spreading, and also what I thought was elderberry. What I thought was canadensis that I also purchased. But again, now I'm like, how much of my hedgerow is masquerading as? Yeah.
Well, at least for,
But it's all being eaten. The birds love it.
yeah. What color are the berries on the dogwood? That's another thing. I didn't mention it.
I have purchased gray dogwood, silky dogwood, and now I have, but they're white on the
Okay.
red dogwood.
Okay. Yeah, so Sericea, the native one, you'd expect to be white, but also
Okay,
alba, I think, is also white.
yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah,
But it just, the shape.
it's
is
really
now
vase shape.
kind of like, is it
Huh.
more of a vase or is it more of a sticking up everywhere?
That's interesting. Send me an email.
Okay.
Yeah,
Pictures.
yeah, that'd be
And what
interesting.
about goldenrod? I got a few volunteers, I was like, "Yay, go ahead.
Goldenrod's a super aggressive native.
Yeah, and it went crazy.
I'm-
and There were no controls. Yeah.
Well, I'm not aware of any non-native lookalikes to our goldenrods.
Okay.
For what it's worth.
Okay.
Not to say that it's not an aggressive plant and it doesn't take
Yeah,
over.
I let it go, but I can swerve on it. But I got a big garden, so.
Yeah.
won't help.
It's a goldenrod patch.
Yeah, good natives. A lot of good
Yeah.
natives.
I thought it was
They
a
grow
great thing, but
very well.
maybe it takes a while for the butterfly to find it. So, they're not laying any eggs on it. so. Not
I
yet.
don't know.
I was gonna say, like, for the nurseries, well, just, it seems to me like, if, like, yeah, like the native nurseries, they're in the shopping center, and, like, but if they're getting their plants in on a truck, it's probably not a great, so, or, you know, I'd be more worried about it, but anyway. But for the animal gear, like, with the hybridizing so much, do you think, like, as far as it, like, ecologically being helpful, do you think it is, like, matters as much as it's a hybrid, or?
It's a great question. How significant is hybridization to the ecological function of these plants? This is kind of where it's a really tough question to answer. It's tough to answer whether the hybrids that have native origin are acting differently than the hybrids that have origins from introduced species. We're trying to figure out what to call these things. Nonetheless, what each individual cross is doing on the landscape. I'd be almost certain that there are differences between different crosses and what caterpillars they're supporting, how much nectar they're making, how much fruit they're setting. I would hesitate to speculate beyond that, though. It's something that I'm kind of concerned about because we're gonna see some of these non-native hybrids move onto the landscape. And when I'm thinking about how are we supporting the plants themselves and not just the things that depend on the plants. Spreading non-natives onto the landscape, I see that as a concern. But it's a really tough question to answer, and we're probably about 100 years from actually answering it.
So sorry, just so the Amalek gears, there are non-native ones that are hybridizing too with the.
Yeah, so we have two native species in Northeast North America. There's another species in Southeast North America. And then there are about 3 species in Western North America. And then those original species all have hybridized and multiplied their genomes and made a mess on the landscape and made it really confusing for us poor botanists.